Hello, and welcome to our next discussion in our Guidehouse webinar series, Pathways to Resilience Infrastructure 4.0. My name is Christine Richards, and I'm with Guidehouse, and I'll be the host for the webinar today. We're really excited to have you here. So today what we're going to be talking about is just talking about the securing the grid in the fourth industrial revolution. There are a lot of benefits as well as threats as the grid starts to become more distributed. And, we're here to talk about how utilities can really prepare for the best and also, protect against the worst that could arise from a lot of the changes that we're seeing. So with that, before we get in and really introduce our panelists that we have here on the call today, just want to talk a little bit about Guidehouse's energy, sustainability, and infrastructure segment. We're a team of about 700 people within Guidehouse, and we're really focused on creating more sustainable and resilient, governments, organizations, cities, and infrastructure. And it's a great organization to be a part of and work with as we're kind of looking to what's next within communities and infrastructure. Now, one thing to note, part of our Guidehouse Energy, Sustainability, and Infrastructure segment is Guidehouse Insights, and you'll be hearing that name, potentially throughout this call. And it's really Navigant Research. So that name has changed. Navigant Research is now Guidehouse Insights. And you can see some ways here to connect with us, through Guidehouse ES&I as well as Guidehouse Insights. So we encourage you to connect with us and keep the conversation going. So with that, we're talking about connectivity and security. This is something that we need some great panelists and experts on the call with us to be able to do that. So I'm going to go through and do some quick introductions here, and then we'll start to dive into the conversation. So with that, first of all, we have Chris Louris on the call. Chris is a partner with Guidehouse who's focused on risk, regulatory, and compliance. Chris, where are you today? Where are you calling in from?
I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Nice. It's great to have you here, Chris. So I see a lot of sports memorabilia in the background. Anything you want to highlight there, like anything that you're particularly proud of and want to share?
That's a great question. There's a lot I'm proud of, but right behind me is I just received Kobe Bryant newspaper collection.
Oh, wow.
LA Times of all of his articles ever in the LA Times, and all of his memorial stuff as well. So it's pretty special to me, and I'm a big fan. So anything Lakers is my biggest prized possession.
Okay, nice, love it. Now, Chris, how did you get into, risk, regulatory, and compliance? I was looking at your background. You went to University of Utah. You have a background in economics and communications. How did you get into, risk and security?
I started my career 17 years ago with the Public Utility Commission in Utah, focusing on all matters of energy regulation, and then made my way in 2008 to the Western Electricity Coordinating Council when they started the new NERC regulatory regime in 2007, 2008. For that 7 years that I spent at WEC, we helped develop, create, and execute all of the security and reliability compliance processes that exist today, the audits, the enforcement, the risk, the controls, and oversaw all of the Western Interconnect utilities.
Awesome. Well, it's great.
And then I came to Guidehouse, and I've been here for 5 years.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have you on the call today. All right, so next up is Marianne Bailey. She's a director within Guidehouse who's really part of our advanced solutions group focused on security. Marianne, it's great to have you here today. Where are you based?
Oh, I'm based in Maryland. I work out of our Washington, D.C. offices.
Okay, nice. And it looked like you worked for a long time with the National Security Administration. What brought you to Guidehouse, and what are some of the things that you're working on right now?
Right, so I did. I spent over 30 years with the National Security Agency, working cybersecurity and everything that was called before it was cybersecurity. So I've been working this for a very, very long time. I left there as a senior cybersecurity executive, and really no other higher jobs for me. So it was time to look for other things to do. And I wanted to step outside of government, and I found Guidehouse. Guidehouse found me. And so I'm leading our cybersecurity practice here, and it's exciting.
Awesome. All right, well, it's great to have you here as well. Last but not least, we have Rochelle Elberg, who is really one of our networking experts and one of our leads within the Guidehouse Insights group. Rochelle, how are things treating you in isolation? It sounded like you had maybe a staycation last week. Is that right?
I did. I stayed home and relaxed and read a lot of books, worked on a novel I'm writing, and binged Twin Peaks.
Yeah, I think as we were talking about earlier, yeah,
I got
definitely.
outside a bit because it's been lovely weather here in New Mexico.
Oh, okay, awesome, awesome. So how did you get into, kind of developing the networking expertise that you have?
So it's been a long career. I became my first job out of college was as a research analyst with a company called Paul Kagan Associates out in California. And I was learning the cable TV industry and broadcasting. And then I was asked to move into our cellular telephone group in 1994. And of course, cellular wasn't that much of a thing quite then. But ever since, I've been in one way or another an analyst in the telecom space. And I came to what was then called Pike Research back in 2012 as a contractor, and then signed on with Navigant Research in 2013.
Awesome. All right. Well, we have a great set of panelists here today. I'm here to talk about networking and all the cybersecurity questions that you all may have. So before we get into our discussion, we really want to hear from you. You're invited throughout this webinar to ask us any questions that you may have that you want the panel to address. But we also want to have you answer a few poll questions just to help get the conversation started. So with that, I'm going to bring up the first poll here. And what we'd like to know from you is what's a topic that you'd love to cover in today's webinar? So if there's something you're looking to hear about, we definitely would like to know about that. And the way to do this is you're going to have to go into your browser, and Matthew Spady, our producer for the webinar, should have the link posted in there in the chat box. So click on that, and we're looking to see, what you're looking to hear from us today about. All right, so take just a few moments to do that. We have how to best accomplish and refresh pricing in a dynamic tech and regulatory environment. We have someone who's just interested in the topic in general, so that's good. Let's see if anything else comes up. Securing a decentralized grid. I feel like we're going to get to that, so you're in the right place. All right, so let's see if we have anything else come up here. All right, supply chain risk. I think that's definitely something we're going to cover. So we'll talk about that. Vulnerability of the grid. Yeah. All right, top threats at the moment. Okay. And then the connection between Industry 4.0 and the grid. Okay. Excellent. These are some great topics. All right. So we'll take one more moment here. Take a look at this, and then let's move on to the next question that we have. So we have a couple of questions here, really just to get a sense of, how you feel about your organization's grid networks, and then also just around, some cybersecurity threats. All right, so you should be able to use the same link that you've been using for the first question. And what we want to get a sense of is how satisfied are you with your organization's networks to support an increasingly distributed grid? And while we're waiting for this, I invite our other panelists to perhaps comment on this and talk about what we're seeing here on the screen. Looks like people
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by these responses. Moderately satisfied. That's kind of how I view the state of the connectivity and security in the grid. Everyone's working on it, but they're not necessarily where they want to be yet.
Yeah. So definitely some room for improvement. But yeah, there's definitely progress that's being made. All right, so take just one more moment here if you want to put your answer in there, and then we'll move on to the next one. And the next one's really focused in Kristen and Mary Ann's space, so we'll get your commentary for that one. All right, so next question. All right, how concerned are you about third-party energy providers and their impact on security of the grid? So again, you can use that same link, and this question should have come up for you. All right, and we're seeing some responses come in. It's always fascinating to watch it move back and forth. All right, so Chris or Marianne, what do you think about what you're seeing here?
Yeah, I was a little concerned when it first started populating because it looked like it was like 50% not concerned at all. And I was wondering, what do they know that I don't? I'm very concerned about. The more distributed the environment is, right? The more players that you have, the lack of governance that you have, the more owners, the less standards and policies and processes are implemented. I think I'm very concerned about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And one of the things that we'd love to talk about here today is really the orchestration of not just between companies, but within each utility is not where it needs to be yet. So yes, I would be very concerned.
Okay. All right. Well, we're definitely seeing that in this poll. So we'll look forward to getting into it a little bit more. All right. So I'm going to stop that. All right. Thank you so much, for everyone's feedback within that poll. All right, so let's get into this. We're going to really have a good discussion here, I think, around talking with that aspect of looking at connectivity and networking across a more distributed grid. So Rochelle, we'll talk with you a little bit first about that, and then we'll get into those security issues and challenges as well as opportunities. And we'll talk to Chris and Marianne a little bit more about that as well. So just to dive in and kind of set the stage here, the title of the webinar was looking at this fourth industrial revolution. And Rochelle, to help set the stage there, how do you define the fourth industrial revolution? Just to give people a little bit of background with that in case they're not familiar with the topic.
Yeah, well, I actually brought a prop. So the fourth industrial revolution, I highly recommend this book. It was written by a gentleman named Klaus Schwab. And he's with the World Economic Forum. This came out in 2016. And I'm going to define it the way he does, which is the first industrial revolution used water and steam to mechanize production. Second industrial revolution used electric power to create mass production. Third, used electronics and information technology to automate production. And the fourth can be thought of as a progression of that third revolution, but it's differentiated by the velocity, the scope, and the system's impact that it may have. So when you talk about Industry 4.0, which is how it is often abbreviated, you're talking about ubiquitous connectivity, sensing, measurement throughout industrial and non-industrial applications. But according to Mr. Schwab, it's going to be much more impactful to the industrial world than, I think on the residential or consumer side, we've already experienced a great deal of change and revolution with our smartphones and all that connectivity, but now it's coming to industry and including utilities.
Okay, and what does that mean for resiliency? I think that's really a theme that we talk about through this webinar series. I mean, how does Industry 4.0 really kind of change resiliency when we look at the grid?
So it's all about the increased computing power, the increased visibility that operators can now have throughout the distribution grid. You've got assets that can be connected. You can put sensors, economically put sensors out at the grid edge. You've got smart meters that can do much more than just read power consumption information. You can have real-time video monitoring if your networking is broadband capability. So physical security, in addition to the cybersecurity topic we're covering here today, you can automate. We have applications are being developed to de-energize a line when a fault occurs so that fires may not be started. Another example is in asset management. You know, historically, utilities are keeping track of their big critical assets in a spreadsheet, and they're sending a guy out in a truck once every month or every 6 months, whatever the standard is for that asset. But with sensors and connectivity, they can be getting real-time information. They can know in advance, you know, analytics with machine learning can identify an aberration in the asset's performance. And so it's really about optimization, but also improving the resiliency. With all of these different capabilities, you have fault location, isolation, and service restoration capabilities in the distribution grid. So it really can minimize outages and other problems that might happen.
Yeah, and we saw on the poll just a little bit ago, you know, we talked about how, you know, the grid, the communication networks are evolving, you know, they're getting better, but there's still work to be done. So what are you seeing as some of like the big trends right now in terms of, you know, networking and where utilities are with their networking right now?
So there are a couple of big trends I will identify, but first let's just set the stage. We have thousands of utilities in the U.S. alone, and they are all at very different stages of deploying connectivity beyond, say, the critical transmission network, substations, and assets. But the big trend that I've observed over the last 7 years here with Guidehouse is that connectivity is going deeper and deeper into the distribution grid. You have field area networks now that are deploying at the grid edge, whether they be for smart meters or not. But utilities, you know, a large IOU could be managing dozens, 1, 2, 3 dozen different networks for different purposes. And this is not efficient. Those networks also may be quite old. They may have higher latency or lower bandwidth capacity. So what the big trends I see now is the increasing deployment of fiber into the distribution grid, into distribution substations. And then the other big trend is increasingly you'll see C-level executives and strategic managers at utilities talking about a more holistic strategy for their networking. They're looking at solutions like private LTE, wireless solutions, so that they have broadband throughout their entire territory. And it has the bandwidth and the latency to support a multitude of applications.
All right. Yeah, so I really like that around the optimization piece, but really that, you know, I mean, there are a lot of this infrastructure that's being upgraded and has to be changed to really be able to accommodate these areas.
Yeah, and it has to happen on the fly, and it has to happen without, you know, letting anything that's existing today in place fail.
Yeah, definitely. We can't just stop the grid and upgrade it. It's something that has to be going on while we're producing power. So no, that's definitely great insights. Now, Chris and Marianne, you've heard this, you know, all this connection going on, you know, this increasingly distributed grid that's taking place. You know, what are really the cybersecurity risks that you're seeing today, you know, as it pertains to this more distributed grid that we're starting to see? And Chris, if you want to start out, that would be great to get your insights.
Yeah, I'll start off by what I alluded to earlier is given these technological advances, the number of processes, systems, tools, regulations continue to rise at a rapid rate. And our utilities have struggled with really orchestrating all of those and integrating all of those throughout their company. We have a lot of our utilities in our world, we work with cybersecurity staff and NERC-CIP compliance staff, infrastructure protection staff, that is in charge of implementing security compliance measures. One of the problems that we've seen is they've used the compliance thresholds as their finish line, if you will. What that means is not all assets are afforded the strong security protections that the NERC-CIP requirements afford. And specifically, many generation and transmission assets are not afforded the same protections, especially distribution. Those fall outside of the NERC-CIP regulatory requirements. So we see a lot of risk in the distribution area, which we'll cover a little bit later. In addition, over the last 12 years or so, we've seen the technology and the regulations stack, and the implementation of these processes have been done in silos. So we've seen the siloing effect, where transmission will do one thing, generation will do another thing. As an example, it's very common to pick on patch management for a minute. It's very common for us to see a transmission business unit do patch management 7 or 8 different ways with 3 or 4 different vendors that they use, which the problem with that is you're not learning and monetizing from your best practices, and you're also not correcting some of your biggest weaknesses and learning as an organization. I know, Marianne, this is probably consistent in other industries as well.
Correct, yeah. So when you have a system like this, where it's a very large, complex system, right? So you talk about, generation, transmission, distribution, all of this going to much more digitization, and it becomes very complex and very difficult to be able to have a good handle on what's happening in all of those areas. And as we know, cybersecurity adversaries, they look for the seams all the time, right? They're looking for gaps and they're looking for seams. And when you don't have this holistic view of what your architecture looks like from, all the way down to your endpoints. Rochelle talked about all these great technologies and sensors. One of the things that we find in cybersecurity is that technological advances are always way ahead of the cybersecurity that supports them. So whether you're talking about machine learning or you're talking about sensing, many of these things don't have the cyber elements in them that we would want to see in them to prove that they're actually an authenticated device on the network. They're not somebody else's device, or like Chris said, that they're patched. So we're not worried about an adversary getting into them because they have a well-known patch. So that the more complex it gets, the more devices on the network, the more decentralized all of that is. It's much, much more difficult to secure from a cyber perspective. And other industries are going this way also. You're seeing lots of technology, bringing all kinds of great things, to us to enable missions to be able to succeed and to monitor real time, all kinds of things like that. But with every single one of them, obviously you can imagine with all the COVID stuff going on, I've been spending a lot of time talking to the healthcare clients, and it's the same types of conversations we're having, whether we're talking about telemedicine, right, whether we're talking about med tech devices. So you see the same types of conversations we're having in other industries.
Okay, and why? I mean, you talked about the security is lagging in some of these areas. I mean, what are the key reasons that these security processes are lagging? I mean, what would each of you point out as maybe one key area in terms of why it's lagging? Marianne, how about you?
I think priority. People want the capability. They want it quick. It takes time to build security in. Another thing is you see 1 million of these high-tech devices out there. They're not interoperable. They're using different types of security, maybe, or different levels of security. So it doesn't give you a great security piece. One of the biggest problems that we see is that companies go buy all types of different security devices to do one-off kinds of things, and they don't interoperate at all. So,
Chris, how about you? Oh.
It's funny.
Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry.
Former role as the director of enforcement many years ago for WEC. It's funny how mandatory and enforceable regulations prompt utilities to take action. One of the things we see, particularly in distribution, because that is not regulated by NERC and FERC, and the states have been a little slow to enact intrastate commerce cybersecurity rules. We have seen some in the physical security area, especially in California, but we are not seeing holistic cybersecurity regulations yet for distribution. From our perspective, that's one of the reasons why they're lagging behind some of the other areas. Just an important point on distribution. Rochelle knows a lot more about this than I do, but I heard a stat that it roughly 80% of grid infrastructure is distribution. However, it is the area that we probably have the least security controls, the least amount of monitoring and physical and cybersecurity processes. one could say, and I've had these arguments before, well, distribution, it's not technically connected to the bulk electric system. I would argue that a coordinated attack on 3 critical distribution facilities in New York or Los Angeles could be catastrophic there are some smart bad guys out there.
Yeah. And Rochelle, how about you? What do you want to add there?
Well, I just wanted to point out that both in my introductory comments and in Marianne and Chris's comments, we're all talking about holistic strategies. It raises the question, though, are the networking folks at the utilities working holistically with the cybersecurity folks at the utilities? And I'm not entirely sure that's the case yet, but again, this is kind of where we want to go, not necessarily where we are today.
Yeah, so it's definitely a progress. I think, Chris, as you said, there isn't that finish line to necessarily cross, and it's really something that needs to be looked at from that holistic standpoint. Now, something else that came up, we had that as one of the topic areas people were interested in, is around supply chain. So, talking about the security of the supply chain and the risks that are presented there. What are thoughts around that piece and the security piece that needs to be considered there? Chris, do you want to start out with that?
Yeah, and this is obviously one of the hottest topics in our industry, even before President Trump's executive order came out last week. The good news is that many of our large utilities have been implementing supply chain risk management programs over the last couple of years in preparation for the NERC CIP 13 standard, which requires that, and it goes into effect, I believe, it was deferred to October of this year. Our perspective is that the executive order obviously doesn't just apply to NERC CIP reliability and security risk. It applies to national security risk, which is going to incorporate many more protection of many more assets on our system. From our perspective, it is furthering and supporting the work that has already been done in industry, and it certainly is a good thing. As technological advances continue to stack and as we modernize our grid, our supply chain expands in scale or scope. I mean, that is the bottom line risk, and it's a big risk in our industry.
Yeah. And Marianne, do you have anything to add around that?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't mention when I introduced myself is my last job at NSA. I had a responsibility called the Deputy National Manager for National Security Systems, which basically meant I had responsibility for the national security systems for the United States of America from a cybersecurity perspective. And we talked about supply chain management, supply chain risk management all the time. I sat on lots of White House councils discussing how we're going to handle supply chain. It's not easy. Not to crack. It's very, very complex. It has multiple facets of it. It has one facet from something that I think we've all learned in COVID, which is where are the things that are critical to you in responding to a pandemic being manufactured. So from that perspective, when you're looking at critical infrastructure, you want to know where the critical devices that you need to operate are being manufactured, and are they being manufactured in a friendly place? Do you have them being manufactured in many places? The other aspect of that is who are your third parties, right? From my last job, I certainly wanted them to be if they were coming from other countries, I wanted them to be countries that we were friendly with. Countries that we didn't have to worry about, relying on them if something happened politically that we wouldn't have them to rely on anymore. And so you have both of those facets that you're dealing with. And I think when we talk about, there are regulations in the US. I think when we talk about the last mile that we've been talking about and that, that distribution and who are the companies that are providing that, I think that's another area in energy that we need to look at. I'm not so sure that we've looked at that as stringently as we should have yet.
Yeah, and I think that's something we've gotten in some questions around that, around the distribution level, the security that goes on there. And I think we've touched upon that. But another question that had come in was around, given these, standards and regulations, what really, how does the government really and perhaps, the technology communities. I mean, how do we ensure that these standards are upheld, but also not, causing significant cost increases to, vendors, suppliers, and consumers? I mean, where's the right balance there? How do we start to consider that balance between, security and the cost of that security and regulation? And I'm going to see, who should I pick on to answer this first?
I'm happy to go. And I think we're still, and this really applies broadly to not just our U.S. utilities. We know that the UK government is interested in supply chain as well. We know the TSOs and DSOs in Europe are interested in this topic, and moving on this topic. This is a big risk. This is a big risk in our industry that at this point it's hard to balance and sacrifice cost for protecting the risk of national security in many cases. So from our perspective, I don't think that's a question that I would answer yet. I think it's a matter of mitigation right now. And once we have a year or two under our belt on what this really costs, then I think we can make that decision on how much more investment we need to make in this area. But this is a critical priority.
Yeah. And Rochelle, how about you? I mean, you work a lot with the technology community. I mean, what do you see from their perspectives around, the cost of security, or being able to support some of these regulations? What are you seeing there?
Well, if you talk to the technology vendors or service providers, if you're talking about a wireless carrier, they all emphasize security very, very highly. Now, I'm not a cybersecurity expert or an engineer, so I can't necessarily doubt or support those claims. But everyone, I think, in the industry understands the importance of that security. It's constantly touted as a benefit to a given solution, but it's touted by every provider as a benefit to their solution. So it's hard for me to rank them. But I would absolutely agree that communications networking providers, the Ciscos of the world, the Verizons of the world, they all understand very, very well the importance of that security and prioritize it.
Okay. And Mary Ann, do you have anything you want to add around this area?
The only thing that I would add is that I think we all understand that you cannot be 100%, right? When it comes to cybersecurity, you cannot be 100% protected, never, which is why there are programs that look at things like high value assets. I mean, I think it's a really important way to look at what are the things that are critical for you to be able to continue to do your business, and then what are the cyber risks to those, and then you weigh them and you invest in those. You can't do everything, so you have to pick the things that are most important to you. I think Chris kind of alluded to, if there was a major attack in New York or California. I remember when I was meeting with some leadership in the state in New York, and they were telling me they had a 3-day supply of water. If something happened to their water distribution, to be able to provide water, right, to the New York City, they'd have to evacuate after 3 days, that's all. And so, yeah. I mean, when you think about, people don't realize how fragile we really are, right? We're very fragile. And when you're talking about, energy, you're talking about things that could result in loss of life if we can't, appropriately provide it. It's not just inconvenience, not just your internet going out,
Yeah.
Significant.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, we have I feel like a theme of questions coming in around, the roles of different technologies and cybersecurity. So I just wanted to go through a few of those and get your perspectives on it. So the first one was really around blockchain, and someone wanted to know, what role will blockchain have in cybersecurity for utilities? Anyone have any comments around that?
Chris, do you want to go? You want me to go?
Yeah, no,
it looks like you had a good answer that you were thinking of. So.
Oh, Chris, for me.
Oh, Mary Ann.
Oh, let's go with Chris first, and then we'll go to Mary.
This is an area that we don't deal in a lot in utilities. It's not something that we tackle with our utilities, and it's not something that regulations apply to at this point. And it kind of, from our perspective, it's obviously a risk, but it's not a well-managed risk in my area of expertise.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think blockchain is still a fairly immature technology. I think you'll see it playing in all types of things from a cyber perspective, as far as to authenticate transactions and processes and stuff like that. I don't really know specifically how it applies to energy today, but it's definitely it's something that's promising, and we'll see more stuff happening with it in the future. You see more in the finance area.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, so I know a little about blockchain, and I'm not an expert, but it has some very interesting applications. It's being talked about not only for transactive energy, which is kind of the application that I think most people think of when they think of blockchain and utilities, but actually there are other applications, operational type things, asset management areas. So, and my understanding of the technology is that it is inherently low risk because, well, I can't even explain exactly because why, but it's sort of like self-balancing, and no one person can change the whole chain, if I understand right. So I actually wonder if it's a high cybersecurity risk or not, but Chris and Marianne know more than I on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a high cybersecurity risk. I just think, I think it's we still haven't implemented it as broadly as we could. And you're right about it. The whole point of it is that you get this assurance all the way through every action that's made. Somebody can't come into the middle and change, change an action in the middle, or they can't change a financial transaction. It gives you assurance all the way through. So there is a lot of promise. I think the financial industry is probably the first one that's really moved out and using it for obvious reasons, because you have authorization of all the financial transactions.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. Another area that people had questions around was just the intersection of automation and security. So this attendee asked, are automation solutions a good fit or a poor fit for the security needs of a more sophisticated system? So automation and security, any thoughts around that, Marianne? How about you?
I have a lot of thoughts about that, and I think that's what's going to kind of save the day for us is automation and security. There's so many things that are happening on your system. So whether it is keeping your systems configured appropriately, keeping them patched appropriately, right? Whether it is looking at, I'm sorry, something just flew by my head. Whether it's doing asset management on your, on your networks, whether it's looking at incidents of compromise that you're seeing come in and how you're responding to them. There's incredible playbooks and stuff for cyber where you see an adversary coming in and doing something, and if it's a very familiar thing and you have a playbook on it, you can respond to it in an automated fashion. There's automated orchestration engines which do that on your behalf. So there's ways with automation that allows you to actually respond in cyber relevant time instead of human time. We're much slower, right? It can pick up anomalies in your network. You start coupling it with like AI and ML, which you're used to seeing. You build a picture and then you see something out of the norm. You're going to catch that with automation and AI types of things much more than you will with a human. You hear about data breaches, and the adversary's been in many of these networks for months. 6 months, 9 months. I think the average is like 6 months before they're ever really detected. And so with automation and AI, you have a much quicker chance to kind of see them and remediate them almost immediately.
Excellent.
I couldn't agree more with Marianne, and a couple of things from, there isn't one conversation we don't have with our senior leadership at our utilities that doesn't involve automation. We want to be automated. We want to be operationally excellent. You can think of it both from security and from cost effectiveness. And we still see patching happen where some analyst is reviewing patches on vendors' websites and taking that research and sending it to IT. Can you imagine, there are automated solutions where that all happens with the push of a button, or it just happens automatically every 30 days. Those are the kind of solutions that A, save you time, and B, allows you to make patching quicker, the process to move through the system quicker. Same with change management. Change management is a huge pitfall that we see with security when an asset goes online or offline. Does it have all the right processes connected to it that must happen going forward? The answer is, in our industry, it doesn't. Can we automate change management? Can we automate that and connect that with asset management? The idea is yes, but we're not there yet. We have a long way to go in the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really like how you bring up the change management piece and just being able to have that automation to help support that, because people can only take it so far, and then having those resources to be able to have that more sophisticated system sounds like it's very important. Well, that brings up, I guess, another piece of this conversation, which is the role of people in all of this. So it'd be great to hear your perspectives around personnel challenges or opportunities, for utilities as they look to, improve and kind of bolster their cybersecurity efforts. So, Marianne, how about you? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of kind of those people challenges and opportunities?
Yeah. So I'm going to stand on my little soapbox because I have a little soapbox that I stand on anytime I talk to anybody about cybersecurity. And people think of cybersecurity as the IT department's problem. Still, a lot of times. And the weakest link in cybersecurity is actually the human element, all of us. It doesn't matter if you're in the mailroom, it doesn't matter if you're in the boardroom, it doesn't matter where you are, but cyber adversaries are targeting you no matter what your job is. And so you have to really understand, look at every time there's a major breach or a major issue, I always look to see what was the cause of it. And it's always human, almost always. There's some human element. Somebody clicked on, like the big thing today, I'm going to go back to COVID and healthcare. You see all these phishing emails coming out because we're human, right? And we're very curious. And so something comes up that says, hey, have you seen the latest stats in your area? And you want to click on that. You want to look at it, right? And it looks like it's real because it has something CDC somewhere in the URL, right? Or maybe it has their logo on the page. It is very hard to prevent humans from doing that. And so the cyber adversaries, they're just successful in it. They're very successful. So just the education programs, that's one aspect of the human, just really trying to help people be aware and understand what they have to worry about with cyber. And it's not just in your business life, it's in your personal life also, right? We're all digital natives, we're on the net all the time doing things and just being very, very cautious. I always tell my kids, if it sounds too good to be true, it's too good to be true. If they want an answer yesterday because the police are going to show up today and take you to jail, it's not true. I mean, they're looking for a sense of urgency. They're trying to panic you into doing something. They're trying to entice you. So it really is the human element. And then just making sure that people kind of segregate their work computers. I've done a lot of stuff. We put a lot of stuff out on telecommuting, challenges of telecommuting and coming in. And it really is, being on your company's computers and all this stuff. So it is not being on your personal computer doing company work. So it's really just smart practices and educating. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is there isn't a business out there that doesn't deal with cyber and cyber issues. There isn't. And so they all need cyber talent. And we just do not have enough of that talent. Not enough. There's been national, things have come out of the White House saying what the shortage is for cyber talent. And basically even, we seem to pass the same kinds of people around. We're trying to grow them, but out of, academia and stuff like that, but there's just not enough.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's the people who are, just working within organizations, but also, those cybersecurity experts. Chris, what do you have to add around that?
So the labor economics of cybersecurity professionals are very interesting. And from an individual that's been trying to hire and been hiring SIP and cybersecurity professionals for over 12 years now, it's challenging. A couple of, reasons from my perspective. University curriculum has not caught up to at least the demands that we have in the utility space. There are some cybersecurity programs out there, but there's not many. We see some, obviously, certifications for cybersecurity professionals are at this point still more important than some of the degrees that we see in the industry. Bottom line is, because of the scarcity of these resources, it is pushing upward on these individual salaries, making it very hard to hire. making these individuals very mobile. There's a lot of turnover. You know, I think Marianne's probably had these conversations as well when you go with HR and you're working on salaries, and these security professionals push salary bands, and HR doesn't understand that, you know, these folks come at a premium. So yes, we have struggled with the shortage. You know, from my perspective, utilities have to get better at home growing talent, and, you know, have your security pillars, is what we like to call them, your foundational security professionals with hopefully power system experience, and then develop a training program for, you know, taking junior resources and giving them certifications, investing in their education, having them job shadow both security professionals and power system professionals, so they have the crossroads of both disciplines. That's what makes a really good security professional in the utilities.
Yeah, I like that of taking, you know, people that are in your organization who perhaps have an interest or passion around it, you know, and really being able to grow that. And Rochelle, how about you? I mean, you know, looking at personnel more broadly, you know, looking at the more distributed grids that we have out there. I mean, how are you seeing kind of the people aspect play out in terms of, you know, just embracing that as well as, you know, having a more secure grid?
I mean, I guess all I have to add to what Marianne and Chris mentioned is the changing needs of the grid. So you have automation coming in, and this applies to other verticals, not just in the electric utility world, but also oil and gas, for example, mining. You have a lot more automation coming, and it's growing exponentially. You have autonomous vehicles, you know, pulling rocks out of mines and so on and so forth. And one of the threats that's mentioned in this book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, I was going to mention in the early days, there's only one page in this book about cybersecurity specifically. Now, he does point out that it's very important, but there's literally only one page. He spends the other 150 pages talking about all the benefits we're going to receive from this technology. And I think that's true, but one of the risks he talks about is social inequity and the bifurcation of our society between the highly educated and in demand, and the uneducated or undereducated, and the lack of jobs for them. And so this whole trend is just going to continue to be exacerbated. And I like the idea Chris talked about of you know, training them from the inside and bringing them up from the inside, because I don't see it happening to the inadequate degree in the education system.
Yeah, so that education and training piece, just more broadly, you know, and giving people the right opportunities and helping them grow within it is huge. And we also had one other piece come in around, I think, this training piece, but it was also, you know, training for and education really for, you know, people who may not be cybersecurity experts, but to help them, you know, keep up with the, you know, latest kind of cybersecurity issues and threats. So, you know, how do organizations really stay on top of that in terms of kind of their training and education? And Marianne, I think it'd be great to hear from you about that, because you talked a lot about, you know, people within organizations and kind of keeping up on cybersecurity. You know, what are the effective training programs that are out there to really help, you know, make sure that people are paying attention?
So there's a lot of training in cybersecurity. I think in reality, it's up to probably every company or industry to train their people. I can tell you we had extensive training when I was at NSA. Obviously, we had, you know, I had 3,000 cybersecurity people that worked for me. So, and trained in all kinds of cybersecurity, from, you know, things I can't talk about to defensive types of cybersecurity. But we have the same thing in Guidehouse, right? So we're doing the same thing for our folks. We have a whole knowledge learning center. We have classes that we want any cyber professional to take when they first step in the door, so that we kind of have a level balance. And then we have more sophisticated and very specialized, because cybersecurity, it's broad. It's very, very broad. You're not going to find a person that knows everything about it. There's tons of different technologies, and so you're going to find people that are more steeped in, you know, cryptocurrency or blockchain type stuff like we talked about. Other people might be in like security orchestration and automation like we talked about. So there's all kinds of expertise in it, but I think you have to figure out in your industry what's important to you. There's lots of training and education programs out there. Companies have to pay for their people to be trained. if you want to keep up with it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So we've covered some of the people aspects of all of this, and we've had a lot of great questions coming in. I've really just been going through a lot of the questions. So we have about 10 minutes left here. So if you have a question, a burning question that you really want to ask, get that in there, and we'll see if we have time to get to it. So I want to thank everyone for all the great questions that have come in so far. But I think one that came in pretty early on that I want to go back to, and it ties back into the poll question that we had, where we talked about, how concerned are you with third-party energy providers and their impact on the security grid, or on the security of the grid, and a lot of people said that they were extremely concerned. So, someone asked the question, will utilities trust third-party DERM platforms, or will they insist on creating their own solution? So I think here it'd be great just to talk a little bit about, kind of utilities having that trust in third-party providers versus, doing things their own way. What are kind of some of the balances that need to be achieved there, and what should utilities really be thinking about, as they're looking at those different options? And Chris, I'll throw that over to you first.
Yeah, I think, I guess there's several different angles of this question. And if we look, the changing resource mix, adding new, more renewables on the grid, we have solar and wind plants and developers of those plants and third parties managing those plants. What scares me is oftentimes I will get a call from a new owner, a new, solar developer, or third-party provider, and saying, hey, we're building a security program from scratch. Do you have any advice? That is obviously a big risk in our industry. I think it's on the utilities, whether you have a contractual relationship with these third parties, or there's a way that you can influence some sort of an oversight. Is there a way that you can, especially if you're contracted with them, I would say best practice would be set up some sort of an oversight regime to ensure minimal security protocol and controls that are in place to protect the security of your asset or whatever it is. That to me is the practice that we need to start getting better at, is more oversight and control.
Yeah, so really having, and you talked about that, of the more holistic perspective and approach. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. Marianne, how about you?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with what Chris said. I think that in the security field, we kind of call them mitigating controls. So if you have something that you consider more risky, what are you going to do to kind of mitigate that risk? And I think exactly what he was talking about is the way to do it. More oversight, more guidance and direction to them, and then monitoring that in some way.
Yeah.
So also, I think there should be some talk about like resiliency in that. Like, you don't want all your eggs in one basket. So somehow you have to have some resiliency built in, that if one of these third parties, something happens to that's more catastrophic, then you have other options.
I want to just further that a little bit, and a recommendation for everybody to start thinking about. Our utilities have been focused on for many years the effectiveness of our processes. Okay, there's a lot of metrics and KPIs around how effective our processes and our controls. I think our industry needs to start, in light of the pandemic, really thinking about and implementing resiliency metrics. How resilient are our processes in the darkest of times? Because with cyber incidents, we're talking about low frequency, high impact events. Those could be dark times. So if we have one of those big incidents, how resilient is our business continuity? How resilient is our preparedness for these situations? That's something that we need to test more, we need to improve, and we need to ensure that we're testing it at the darkest moments.
Yeah. And Rochelle, how about you? What do you want to add around this conversation?
Well, coming at it from the communications angle, what I would suggest is that, I spoke earlier about utilities needing to have a much more holistic, territory-wide strategy for their connectivity, and that strategy needs to be in sync with cyber risk and cyber security. But the other thing I would say about networking today is that in the past, a lot of utilities have not wanted or not even been incented to invest or to purchase their networking capacity from a provider. I would suggest that some may want to change thinking around that, simply because Verizon, just as an example, a big carrier, is going to have a lot more of that critical know-how and the resources necessary to stay current with, you know, new hacks and new potential breaches emerging daily. These big organizations stay on top of that. And so, you know, the investor-owned utilities in this country have been incented to build their own networks and to manage their own networks because they get a rate of return on that. But whereas if they hire a third party, that's an operational expense. But it's a lot of work to stay on top of the risks and aware of the new threats that emerge. And so, especially smaller utilities, but maybe all utilities should be thinking a little bit more about where, you know, if they don't have the internal expertise, where they could source that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Getting that expertise and making sure that they have that in place. All right, well, we've had a couple other questions come in. We have about 4 minutes left. One was just a question around, you know, IT and OT. And the audience member felt, you know, there's a lot of discussion around the IT side, but that there are a lot of vulnerabilities coming through, you know, on the OT side. So, you know, what thoughts do you all have around that, around the OT piece and security and what utilities should be thinking about there? Chris, how
I
about
can
you?
start.
Yeah.
I can start really quickly and hand it over to Marianne. We hear a lot about IT OT integration. If you talk to folks in OT and you talk to folks in IT, they'll say integration's impossible. We can't do it. You know, there's merit to some of that argument. Where what I like to say is more of, maybe it's not integration, it's working more in an orchestrated fashion. So oftentimes IT doesn't know what OT is doing, systems don't talk, so it's more coordination, if anything, and that's a very good starting point to see how much and how fully you can integrate the two. I would say, Marianne, anything to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is I've kind of struggled with this for probably the last decade of my career, where people that are developing more physical type of systems, like we talk about when we talk about OT, don't understand that they really are connected to what is the IT, because people think of IT as your desktop, right? And the stuff that you do your business systems on, but they don't think of the things that are linked on the networks. And we've seen cyber attacks to OT, energy sector devices in other parts of the world, and they're very, very catastrophic. We've seen cyber adversaries be able to, you know, block the ability of an operator to see how well a centrifuge is performing, or, you know, a pump or something like that. And so an adversary could get in and do something bad, and you look at it and you think it's operating naturally. So all of this stuff now is becoming digital, right? We're digitally accessing all of these things. So to keep thinking that cybersecurity is just the IT department and it's not just digital, it should be digital. Anything digital, anything with bits, anything accessible, you know, remotely or over a network. So you find these things more and more linked, and we have to just start thinking about cyber in a different way.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's definitely come through in the conversation today, that it's a lot more than just IT. You know, there really is this whole holistic perspective that needs to be looked at. Well, we are unfortunately out of time. We definitely had some other questions come in, so we will pass those along to our panelists so they can take a look at them and perhaps provide some more details around this. It was a great topic to cover. I mean, we had a lot of different things that we were able to discuss here today. But I just want to take a moment to say thanks to our panelists, Rochelle, Chris, and Marianne, for taking the time to chat with us today, to talk a little bit about connectivity and security. And we appreciate all the input from the audience. You all were great. You had a lot of great questions, you know, and thank you so much for participating in the polls early on to help set the stage for the conversation. So that wraps things up for this Infrastructure 4.0 webinar. We appreciate you taking the time. Next up is we're going to take some time to talk about e-mobility next week, so be sure to check that one out as well. Thank you again, and hope everyone has a great day.